on an issue, what did the Sahaba do? The Prophet said, follow my sunnah and the sunnah of my rightly guided. How did the rightly guided, after the Prophet, handle new issues? I like fishing. And so we'll use the metaphor of a fishing rod, where a fisherman who is trying to catch a shark and not prawns knows what type of hook to use, what type of bait, what type of line, what type of rod. Because you're good at producing lines doesn't mean you're good at catching fish. You're just good at producing lines. Because you work in a factory where they produce hooks doesn't mean you're a fisherman. A Mujtahid was somebody who knew how to catch fish, knew what he needed from tafsir and the mufassir, knew what he needed from the muhaddith, he knew what he needed from elsewhere, and everybody respected he was the fisherman. In every new situation, he was the one who was the specialist in fishing for the sunnah. Finding and catching the way and spirit of the sunnah, always, everywhere. The moment a new situation comes, what would be the way to do things that would be in line with the sunnah? Even where the sunnah was silent. And so what they did was actually determine terminology and a hierarchy of reliability for sources, tools, principles and methods of analysis taught and used by the Quran, the Prophet, the Sunnah and the earliest Mujtahids. So, where in the Quran it says, as we gave the example earlier, do not curse or insult the idols that people worship besides Allah, because they may then insult Allah out of ignorance. That type of thinking is a thinking that seems to be concerned about the consequences. Don't do this because that would happen. Even if it's okay to say A'udhu Billahi Minash Shaitanir Rajeem, even if it's okay to describe idols as cursed in and of itself, but because of the consequences, that type of thinking where you are saying something should not be done because of the consequences is called saddu zariya. It's called blocking the means or preclusion. It's a concern for negative consequences. Where somebody comes to the Prophet and says, my wife has delivered a child, but he looks like he's the wrong color, a bit darker than I would have expected, so he doesn't know should he suspect his wife or not. The Prophet ﷺ said, don't you have camels? Yes. Don't you see sometimes the parents are all one color, but the young one comes with a different color? In other words, there's sometimes a recessive gene in this. Says yes. He said then the same thing. Where instead of answering my question, you say, but this is similar to that, and if that is okay, this is okay, that type of reasoning is called qiyas, analogy. It's the same kind you would use. Alcohol prohibited. Why? Because it intoxicates. Cocaine intoxicates, cocaine prohibited. So what you start doing is, you start giving names to types of reasoning that were used by the Prophet and the Sahaba, or used in the Quran. So what you are learning from the Quran and the Sunnah is not just fiqh and rulings, but tools and principles of thinking, methodology of thinking. And so we find in the Sahaba, as we mentioned earlier, the Quran says you should cut the hand of a thief, but due to warfare, that was another reason, Umar would suspend the punishment of cutting hands. Why? Because if somebody stole and you say you're going to cut his hands, he'd rather run off, join the enemy, and you end up having to fight somebody. This concern, or in the case of famine, a concern for general welfare, is given a name called maslahah, public interest. In the interest of the public and the general good of the objectives of Sharia, or the attainment of the objectives of Sharia, a ruling, a normative hukum is suspended. That is called maslahah, concern for public interest, or some will call istihsan, the jurist's preference for achieving maqasid in a particular situation. So the key point we're mentioning here is a lot of this terminology, which we will be looking at very soon, is actually derived from the Quran, the Sunnah, and the Sahaba. So what are the tools of the Mujtahid? Of course, the first is Quran, a source of legislation. Then they look at Sunnah. Hadith as just the narration that carries the Sunnah. And for other scholars of Hadith, the moment a Hadith is Sahih, that's good enough. For Mujtahids, that was not enough. They wanted to know whether the Hadith was Mutawatir or Ahad. Was it just Ahad, single chain, or just a few chains? Or was it Mutawatir, multiple chains where there was no doubt it was true? Because they weighed Hadith with other evidences too. Consensus was important. Was there an early consensus among the scholars on a particular topic? Particularly consensus among Sahaba. Analogy or qiyas we've already discussed. The tradition of the people of Medina, the amal of the people of Medina, was for Malik an important tool, because the city of Medina at his time was where most of the Sahaba died. So the culture doesn't change very easily in any society. It takes decades for cultures to change, centuries sometimes. So if his teachers were students of the Sahaba, and there were certain ways things were done that were left over from the time of the Prophet, even if there wasn't a written hadith, for Malik, that was another source of understanding the Sunnah. So, while hadith is a source of understanding Sunnah, for Malik, amal was even a more respected source, because it was passed down by a whole community. Urf or custom was an important source of legislation. Why did they do that? Because they found when the Prophet ﷺ came, he didn't change every cultural practice. He only changed what contradicted. He respected what didn't contradict. Because people have been created according to the Quran into nations and tribes, that they should know one another. It's a source of identity. Your languages are part of the ayat of Allah. So culture should be respected. And that's how the Prophet treated Jahiliyyah culture. Those parts that were good, he carried on practicing. If it was bad, then he changed. So they realized, therefore, when you go to a new place and you see a new culture, the Quran should be the criteria. If it contradicts, then you change. If it doesn't contradict, you should respect and prefer culture. A lot of what you see in Islamic finance today, of murabaha, ijara, musharaka, these were Jahiliyyah financial tools that were already in use before Islam, but they were fine, they were useful, and they were ratified. So we call them Islamic finance, but not that Islam introduced them. They've been there before. The Ra'i of Sahabi. Now, where there's an ijma, then it's called ijma. But where it's just one opinion of a Sahaba that is not contradicted by anything else, they call that the fatwa or the Ra'i of a Sahaba. So if you look at the Sahaba as a Mujtahid, somebody who understood the Quran properly, understood the Sunnah, saw the Sunnah live, then it becomes the opinion of a Mujtahid. So some would consider that binding, others would not. And there are many other tools. We'll come to these. In the use of these tools to reach conclusions, the question, of course, was what was the best tool? In the military, there's what they call the commander's intent. When a platoon is supposed to go and conquer a particular enemy force, why should we go and conquer them? Why should we attack that group? Because you want to capture a particular hilltop. Why? Because once we can get there, we can get all the reception we need for communication. So what we want is to be able to communicate. Good. Once everybody knows what the objective is, then even if you kill some of the top people, everybody knows where we are supposed to go. It's not scattered. They still know what to do next. Okay? And this is where the commander's intent in usul mattered a lot. When the scholar concerned knew what was supposed to be achieved with this usul, then whatever situation the scholar found himself, he knew it's supposed to end up with justice, not injustice. Yeah. It's supposed to end up with benefit, not harm. And so the subject of maqasid was important. You've watched this program, Master Chef?
Yes.
Yeah. And one of the things they sometimes do is they just get a few ingredients and they just tell you, do something with it. Okay? And this person is supposed to come up with something delicious, and he's been given carrots, a tea bag, and all sorts of things that you just say to yourself, I don't know what to do with those, I'll just eat the carrot. But you're supposed to come up with something nicer. Sometimes the Mujtahid finds himself in that kind of situation. There's no Quranic verse on this issue. The Sunnah is silent on this issue, so he can't go to Quran. Can't say what does the Sunnah say. And he looks at what's available. Is there the opinion of a Sahabi? Is there an Amal of Medina there? Is there an Ijma? They may be one, they may not be the other. Or maybe it's a contemporary issue. It's not in the Quran, it's not in the Sunnah. There's no Ijma of the Sahaba. There's no Amal of Medina on it. There's no Ra'i of Sahaba on it. Okay, so what else is available? And what's the best that this person can do to represent the Sunnah in this new reality? So, the best dish under the circumstances. And here, something very important. What we call safety net tools. They're like insurances. That in the application of the Quran and the Sunnah, that is, even where you do have these tools available, there were certain tools and principles that try to protect the lawgiver's intent. To protect the intent of the Prophet. In other words, from the Quran or from the Sunnah, what could we derive as the commander's intent? Sorry. These were safety net tools. You have circuses here? Yes, okay. But you've seen circuses and these people on their trapezes, acrobatics in the air and all this gymnastics in the air. If you watch below them, whether during the Olympics or whatever, you would find that there's one big safety net. Yeah. That while they're doing all these aerobics and all the gymnastics in the air, if anything goes wrong, nobody gets hurt. The safety net is there to protect. In Usul al-Fiqh, they have certain tools which we will look at. Tools of ijtihad that are there to protect the spirit and purpose of Sharia. That with all the intellectual gymnastics scholars will be doing with with Qiyas and Ijma and the Ra'i of a Sahaba on this issue, etc., they have a safety net. They have an insurance system to ensure whatever logic you're going to do with the text, you don't create a mafsada, you don't create harm. These are like boundary lines that so long as you're going to be just, go ahead with your ijtihad. But you can't move out into injustice. So these safety net principles, as we will call them, are there to prevent harm in the use of reasoning, in the use of ijtihad. They are maqasid tools. They ensure that ijtihad stays on course, that it's meeting the maqasid of Sharia. And the most common one, three most common ones, one is called istihsan, juristic preference. Another one is called maslaha, or public interest. And another one is called sadr-dariya, which means blocking the means or preclusion. There are other names they have, istislah, raful haraj, but to a great extent, a lot of the differences are just in terminology. Yeah. Shafi would accept raful haraj and istislah, but that's early Shafi, but not sadr-dariya or istihsan. Yes.
Excuse me, when it comes to ijtihad, there are certain preconditions for ijtihad. And no ordinary person can probably be given the rights for ijtihad. Can you explain on that?
Okay. Anybody who is going to do ijtihad meaning the use of reasoning in the absence of clear text of the Quran or Sunnah to represent the Prophet. Such a person must know what the Prophet was following, be well grounded in the Quranic sciences. Be well grounded. If you're going to represent your dad, you have to know your dad. If you're going to represent the Prophet, you have to know the Prophet. So knowledge of Sunnah was very important. But then, when the Prophet gave instructions, he lived in a particular context. If you're going to be a doctor that's going to give prescription, you must have the person you're diagnosing. So a scholar who was going to do ijtihad must know the context in which the ijtihad is taking place. Must know what exactly is expected at the end of this ijtihad, the area of maqasid. Must be knowledgeable about urf. So all these tools we're looking at, these are all areas that the mujtahid, ijtihad is what is done by a person qualified, a mujtahid, must be grounded in all of these. Yeah. And that is why a muhaddith, for example, a scholar of hadith, he didn't care about ijma. It's not part of what they study. They don't study qiyas. They don't study amal. They don't study urf. They don't study any of the safety nets. You don't open a book on ulum al-hadith or on tafsir to read more about istihsan, maslaha, etc. It's not part of their area.
Correct.
Yeah.
In that order, can we consider Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi as a Mujtahid, or maybe any other terms?
There are certain individuals that are regarded as mujtahids. Mujtahids are usually divided into two. What they call a mutlaq, which is like an absolute mujtahid who is encyclopedic, and a mujtahid that is muqayyad. In other words, he's qualified in a few specific areas. And because of the breadth of knowledge, it's difficult to get a mujtahid mutlaq that can handle any subject on any issue. Qardawi, bin Bayya, a lot of these scholars are well grounded in usul. They are usuli scholars, so they call usuliyun. And in certain areas, they have become mujtahid muqayyad, in other words, in specific areas. But most of them can't stand alone. And so what has happened today is you have fatwa councils where you get all the different specializations that are able to produce a synergy that end up being even better than a mujtahid mutlaq. Yeah, because you just, nobody can be specialized in everything today. But you need the various specializations coming together, and the fatwa council therefore becomes more credible than an individual.
When there's not expert in that particular field, for instance, the issue of ICs, nobody knows what's going on. And of course, also the issue of Morsi. So who can we refer to?
You definitely refer to those who know better than you. As a general, like whichever subject. Okay. When we say nobody knows, we don't know anybody who knows.
Oh.
But this is where, because it's ijtihad that a group is going to be making, they would look for who they would consult. So when you have fatwa councils, for example, and they're going to discuss something on biomedical issue, they will invite doctors, they will invite public health practitioners, they will invite people who are specialists in the area. So it's not just ulama going to talk about things, they will look for people who actually know the subject area. So in that area, they will get investigative journalists, they will get people who are politicians, they will get people who know what they're talking about to join them, who they would consult, and then they come up with rulings. Because remember, they need somebody who knows the whole. Yeah, they need somebody who knows what's going on the ground. They need somebody who knows what is it going to result in, so that they know whether they are to block the means or not. Yeah, so you need people who are really knowledgeable about the situation, and every situation would require different qualifications. So if it's a banking thing, it would require probably different qualifications than if it's an economic policy. If it's issues on family law, you would require somebody with more background in anthropology or sociology of that society and that culture, and not just, but he's an alim. Yeah, so fatwa councils have a mixed group, and what you have is different fatwa councils for different objectives. So European Fatwa Council would handle European issues, but you don't outsource muftis. You want somebody to decide on you because your situation requires local knowledge. So while they may differ in their terminology, they all accept safety nets. They all agree that once something is going to create problems, there should be relaxation of laws. Yes, please.
Yeah, is there such thing as more than one correct ijtihad on the same issue? Because is it possible that only intended there's one correct opinion on one issue, but different mujtahid come up with different solution for this, and there's only one correct? Because the Prophet says that if you make a correct ijtihad, you get two rewards correct.
There are some issues where what is right and wrong is very clear, particularly if the teachings are explicitly clear from the Quran or from the Sunnah. Where, however, it is not, and the scholar has to exercise his own ijtihad, then it becomes a little more like a patient, like a doctor trying to diagnose a patient, particularly if it's a mental problem. And you could have different psychologists or different psychiatrists coming up with different diagnoses and different prescriptions. So there, even the scholar will say, this is what I honestly believe, but there's the possibility I'm wrong. Because he knows what he had to consider. There are a number of variables that are not all absolutely correct. Yeah. But what is important is that the intention of the scholar is to get as close as possible to the best of his ability to the truth. Only Allah knows whether he is right or wrong. But if he is wrong, the Prophet said Allah still rewards him because he tried to, like you don't punish a doctor who made a mistaken diagnosis if he did what every qualified doctor would do. You know, if you punish that, then they stop, then everybody starts dying. Madhabs.
Yeah. I was just thinking that a more common example, since you use doctors, is whether abortion is allowed or not in Islam. And based on what little research that I've done, is that there are certain circumstances, and like you said, they refer to the specialists, the doctors, the gynecologists, and circumstances in which the life of the mother is at stake if she continues the pregnancy. Then they said it's allowed. I'm not sure if it's recommended or allowed, or it should be done, because then the doctors will say, no, if you continue, you will die for sure. And it's very early in the pregnancy. And so there are many things that they have considered. So I thought that was something that we see more often.
And no, that's a useful example where if you say, what did the Quran say about abortion? We only find the Quran saying, "Wala taqtulu awladakum," don't kill your children. But the scholars differ on, does walad, is walad used in the Quran to describe an unborn child? Because the Quran has different terminology for the growing embryo. And awlad has always referred to children that were born. And the context of the verse is, don't kill your children for fear of want. And a lot of it was tied to this female infanticide, killing children for various other reasons. But the context was children that were born. So what does the Quran talk about children that were not born? And then the differences over the issues on hadith but you find the reason why scholars would differ. But with all the differences of opinion, once life is threatened, since one of the maqasid or objectives of Sharia is the protection of life, and since they know in the qawaid and the maxims that where they are forced to choose between two evils, they will choose the lesser of the two evils, such scholars would see if the life of the mother is under threat, then they can lose a child who has less responsibilities than a mother who has more responsibilities. So definitely you would find the analysis of the text produce different answers, the analysis of the situation, and to what extent and how certain are we that the life of the mother is at threat or at stake would affect differences. So really a lot of it is closer to the healthcare than to the mathematics of straight right and wrong. The madhabs. We all remember God maths? Yeah, good old maths. Where somebody tells you something minus something plus something and something else in bracket, divide by this, multiply by this, plus whatever, what's the answer? You don't just get a calculator and you say start again. No, what they will do is they will actually ask you, rearrange these so that you do things in brackets first and before you divide. And you will divide before you multiply, and multiply before you add, and subtraction is last. So there's a hierarchy and order. How best do you represent the Prophet ﷺ? There's a hierarchy of instruments and tools that the Sahaba used and the earliest Muslims used. In other words, it wasn't just you use Quran or Hadith or Qiyas. No, there's an order. Some were more important than others. When we look at the schools of thought, schools were schools, when we say madhabs, these were schools of consistent methodology of representing the Prophet. They were scholars of tafsir, of hadith, of fiqh, scholars in language, scholars in maqasid. All these scholars put together formed a school, and they accepted there's a particular methodology that they feel is the best in representing the Prophet. So what's a madhab? A madhab is a school that have their own board mass, their own hierarchy. Let's look at some of these. The Hanafi school. For the Hanafi school, Quran was the most important tool. If anything contradicted Quran, Quran was greater than it. The next thing after Quran was Sunnah Mutawatir, multiple chained hadith that supported, that presented a Sunnah. After that, istihsan, juristic preference or juristic discretion. That was more important than qiyas, analogy, which was more important than ijma, which was more important than Sunnah Ahad, a single chain hadith, which was more important than the ra'i or opinion of a sahabi, which was more important than culture, which was more important than the status quo or istishab, presumption of continuity. So for the Hanafis, this was the hierarchy. If you ask the question, they first said, does the Quran answer it? If it answers it, that's really what matters most. If it's not there, they look. If anything contradicts the Quran, they go with that. It's only if the Quran is silent then they will go with a conclusion that the hadith should not be contradicted. If there's nothing there, then they will move that. For the Maliki school, Quran first, Sunnah Mutawatir second, then Amal of Medina, which was their own ijma generally, then Maslaha or public interest, and then Qiyas, analogy, and then a single chain hadith, and then an opinion of a Sahabi, Sadud Daraya, blocking means of preclusion, custom, and the presumption of continuity. Shafi'i school, number 1 Quran, number 2 Sunnah Mutawatir, then Ijma of companions, then single chain hadith, then the Ra'i of a single companion, then Istishab, the presumption of continuity, and then Qiyas last. However, some later Shafi'is were ready to bring Qiyas immediately after Ijma of Sahaba. These schools didn't stay static. They also evolved and they borrowed from each other. And so even though you don't, Maslaha is here, you don't find it here. But today, Shafi'is accept Maslaha. Particularly after Imam al-Juwayni, Imam al-Ghazali, who were Shafi'i scholars, they reintroduced it in certain conditions. The Hanbali school, Quran, Sunnah Mutawatir, Sunnah Ahad, Ra'i of Sahaba, Ijma, Qiyas, Maslaha, Istihsan, Sadr Daraya, Istishab. You find the Malikis and the Hanbalis use the same tools, but they differ in the ordering. They also have Amal, and nobody else has Amal except Maliki. What are the denominators? Zahiri school. More an academic thing, just so that we are aware of it. For them it was Quran, Sunnah Mutawatir, Sunnah Ahad were treated in the same istishab. They did not go with Ijma, their own was just we go with Quran and Sunnah. That's it. The Zahiri did not consider Ra'i of Sahabi, he said no, I'm following Quran and the Messenger. Yeah, my Shahada was about La ilaha illallah and Muhammad Rasulullah. And Prophet said, follow whatever Quran, Sunnah, you won't lose your way. Anything other than that to them is speculative. That's your own opinion.
Can you explain again the
Istishab, presumption of continuity. It is the assumption, a little like, it's also used as a basis for strengthening culture. And for the Shafis, Istishab handles what Urf would handle. Istishab is a way of thinking where the status quo is taken as acceptable unless there is reason to change. That people are innocent and assumed to be innocent unless there's evidence that they are guilty. That parents remain responsible unless there's evidence that they are not responsible for their children. That everything is halal except if there's evidence that it is haram. That type of thinking where you assume the status quo except is called istishab. Yeah. So for many, how have you been doing things? Yeah, we'll stay with that one unless if there's evidence of something else. Yeah. We knew you got married, we didn't know you divorced, so in the absence of proof, we will go by what we are certain. The denominators, lowest common multiple. For all the schools, all of them, Quran, Sunnah Mutawatir. You know, they all start with those two. They start to differ after Sunnah Mutawatir. And so Quran and Sunnah Mutawatir have been the basis for Aqidah. Are you a Muslim? Is not established by any other evidence. It comes from the Quran or multiple chain hadith where there's no doubt of its authenticity. On mu'amalat issues, for example, the moment the Quran is clear on something, Sunnah Mutawatir is clear, please remember, just calm down, chill. Differences are going to start. If it comes from Ahad Hadith or any of the other tools of ijtihad, you will have differing opinions today. To speak in God's name with a level of certainty, scholars consider the authenticity. They also consider the meaning, which we've already touched on, and the implications of the Sunnah. In other words, was it Sunnah or was it Seerah? To help reduce error, there are certain maxims called the Qawaid al-Fiqhiyah that were like traffic rules or ground rules that were derived from the Quran and the Sunnah. They were condensed into 5 major maxims that from so many verses of the Quran and so many practices of the Prophet ﷺ helped create these ground rules. So whatever you're going to do, you do not contradict these. They played a role in protecting the maqasid. One of them was that acts are judged by the intentions behind them. Are you a scholar? Are you on anything? Intention matters. Allah will judge you by your intention. We will try and judge you by your intention if we can. Yeah. You kill somebody, we will try to find out whether it was deliberate or accidental. If we can have enough evidence that it was not deliberate, it's a different crime from murder. So intentions matter. Another one, and to each of these you have various hadith, and I guess some of you, if you want, we can discuss that, but time is not on our side. Certainty is not overruled by doubt. Certainty is not overruled by doubt. You do not let things you are not sure about shape things you are sure about. Yeah, if Allah says He has created everything for your own good, then everything is halal, except if there's haram. But you don't say everything is haram except if it's halal when Allah says He has made everything for your own benefit. I will come back to that. Harm must be eliminated. Harm must be eliminated. Ad-darar yuzal. The moment there's any harm, you must remove it. If for any, like whatever the difficulties should be removed. Obstacles should be taken out of the road. Life should be made easier. But if you cannot remove the hardship, then remember that hardship begets facility. If you can't remove the hardship, you can't remove the starvation, you can't remove the difficulty, then relax the laws. Are we together? Yeah. So hardship begets facility. Then, if we can't solve your hunger problem, we will allow you to take the pig. We'll allow you to take this. The laws relax. Why? Because ultimately, hardship must be removed. And lastly, custom is a basis of judgment, as we've already said on this issue of urf. General rule from this maxim, everything is halal except what is haram. For you to say haram, you need there's a sin. You need explicitly clear evidence from the Quran or Sunnah, not you don't like it. This is considered a general rule. Some consider there are exceptions to this rule, and that in ibadah and aqidah, the general rule is just follow. And if the Prophet didn't do it, then don't do it. And so you have difference of opinion on the subject of bid'ah. For some, the general rule stays general. That even if you innovate in ibadah, it will be assessed based on whether it contradicts the Quran or the Sunnah. So to them, if you want to do any extra dhikr that the Prophet didn't do, it's permitted. Why? Because it's good. And to them, that's how the Sahaba did. The Sahaba innovated. Others feel, no, but the Sahaba are too close to the Sunnah for their actions to be called innovation. We won't go into this topic unless during Q&A we need to, but the understanding is for some, this general rule was general. Others viewed it had exceptions, and one major exception was to do with ibadah and aqidah. When it came to culture and imitation, anybody's culture, everything is halal except what is haram. You want to imitate anybody in anything you want except what is haram.
Is there such a thing, bid'ah hasana in ibadah?
Is there bid'ah hasana in ibadah? In the view of those scholars who, like Imam al-Suyuti, all the scholars who accept Mawlid al-Nabi, they take it you can have good bid'ah in ibadah. And they look at it that since Umar bin Khattab, before Umar's time, even during the time of Bakr, when it came to Taraweeh prayer, it wasn't consistently done as a joint congregational prayer, the way we do today. What we're doing today started with the time of Umar, as a regular everyday thing during Ramadan. Umar described it as a ni'matul bid'ah, that this is a good bid'ah. And so Shafi and some of the earlier scholars took it, bid'ah can be good, it can be bad. And even though it's in ibadah, it could be good. So you have differences there. So if you say after salam, let's stay behind and do dua together after prayers. The Prophet didn't do it, but some see it doesn't contradict anything and it's good to do things in congregation. So to them, that's a good bid'ah, even though it's in ibadah. Others say, no, Prophet didn't do it, Sahaba didn't do it, don't do it. That's another topic. For some, bid'ah doesn't apply to mu'amalat. In other words, if you want to be innovative, go and do it in mu'amalat, don't do it in ibadah. But you have hadith where Aisha radiallahu anha said the first bid'ah to be done after the Prophet was people eating until they got full. But eating is mu'amalat. From the little study we've done on the subject of bid'ah, there are at least 7 to 8 different definitions of bid'ah according to the scholars. It's not our topic, but if during Q&A we need to go into it, we'll do so inshallah. The key thing here is just to recognize scholars differ. Yeah. Ibn Taymiyyah and Imam Shatibi represent one group of no bid'ah in ibadah. Izzuddin bin Abdul Salam and Imam al-Suyuti represent no, they could be good and bad bid'ah in ibadah. So with this, everything is halal except what is haram. The assumption is that things are permissible and the onus of proof is on the person saying something is haram. Yeah. So if you say a woman cannot speak in public, you don't say, bring evidence that you can. No, everything is permissible. It's you who is saying they can't that should bring evidence. Yeah. When you say, don't do this, don't listen to music, don't whatever. Okay, bring evidence that this is permissible. Permissibility doesn't require evidence. Prohibition is what requires evidence. Things are permissible as the default. Yeah. Al-asl fil ashya al-ibaha. The premise is permissibility. It's the person prohibiting that needs to bring enough evidence to counter a verse of the Quran where Allah says He has made things permissible for you, or hadith that make the same point. Quickly, under mu'amalat, scholars require certainty, both in the authenticity and in the meaning and implication. The first port of call, Quran. If Quran says something is haram, it's haram. Remember, everything permissible except what is prohibited. Prohibition needs Quran. If Quran says yes, something is prohibited, then they all agree on haram. If the Quran is silent, they will look at mutawatir. If mutawatir hadith says something is haram, they all consider it haram. If mutawatir hadith do not consider it as permissible, then calm down. I like play. Yeah. The moment it is not here, just calm down. Because you'll remember from our equations, every school differs on what they will do next. Let's take a simple example. Hadith ahad, single chain hadith. Most of the haram and halal come from single chain hadith. So if a single chain hadith says something is haram, You have divided opinions. The Shafi'i say single chain hadith and Hanbali can make a thing haram. The Hanafi say no, single chain hadith can only make makruh tahrimi. The Maliki say single chain hadith not supported by Amal of Medina or only makruh, and some of the Maliki say it's shaz because not supported by no one. If there's nothing in single chain hadith to prohibit something, they will go to other tools of ijtihad, qiyas, ijma, ra'i of sahaba, and they differ in these areas. The key thing is just remember, the moment you pass this line, don't break brotherhood. Yeah, brotherhood established from the Quran. Yes, please.
See, I thought from the previous class, UID and one, you said something that only Hanbali thinks that a single chain hadith can make a ruling haram, but not Shafi'i.
No. Both Hanafi and Shafi'i can. The difference between Hanafi and Shafi'i is Shafi'i would consider ijma as stronger than ahad hadith, whereas Hanbali, ijma is not stronger. Yeah. This is where nothing contradicts. Nothing contradicts. They will keep going. They're all fine. It's where you have conflicting evidence, then they start putting things in hierarchy, and then it will start to matter. Yeah, so if ijma supports this, then Shafi and Hanbali would be together.
Sorry, sir.
No.
One more time. Is this Imam Shafi and Imam Ahmad themselves or their followers?
They are followers too. Good point. Shafi, in their own equations, in the school, so let me just say, this is Imam Shafi himself and the early Shafi school, until Ghazali and some of these other scholars who were also considered as Mujtahid scholars within the school brought in maslaha. Ibn Taymiyyah brought istihsan above ahad hadith in the Hanbali school. Yeah. So the real purpose of this diagram is really to know where differences begin and that there's a system. Yeah. There's a systematic approach to handling issues. It's not arbitrary, and it's not something anybody just does because I read a book or I read the Quran or I read Sahih Bukhari or whatever.
What is the example that ijma is different with hadith ahad? Contradict with hadith ahad.
Okay. If you take, for example, in the Maliki school, where, okay, let's start with the reasoning. Where all the Sahaba, for Shafi, at least for the early Shafi, ijma of Sahaba was what was most important. If all the Sahaba say one thing, and you have a single chain hadith saying something different, which do you think a scholar would go with? The single chain hadith or Sahaba? They go with Sahaba. Like, they can't all be wrong, so one person's evidence cannot counter that. So ijma was heavier. For Maliki, the amal of Medina, the practice of the people of Medina, was heavier, because that was their ijma, that's something that was brought down. So in the hadith, there are two ways of doing adhan for prayer. There's the common way, but there's the Maliki way. In the Maliki school, you start by saying Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, and then in a low voice you say Ashhadu la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Then you say it in a louder voice, Ashhadu la ilaha illallah, etc. And when you're doing your Allahu Akbar, Allah, Maliki will say bid'ah. That's not how it came to him. Less music though. But there are two hadith, and when somebody presented from Malik, but there's this other hadith on how to recite adhan, and he felt it was stronger, Malik said, but this city has been reciting adhan every day from the time of the Prophet. Whatever hadith you want to bring, this is the one we're going with. Yeah. We can take more examples later. I'm just concerned, Lim will come and tell me at 1 o'clock. So, when it comes to the certainty over the evidences, they were concerned about authenticity, they were concerned about meaning. Where they were certain that something was authentic, no argument about it, like Quran or Sunnah Mutawatir, they would say it's qat'i. Where the meaning was explicitly clear, they would call it qat'i, which meant certain, unambiguous, clear, not debatable. Where there was a level of probability in the evidence or the credibility, they would say it is dhanni. Or in the meaning, they would say dhanni. So you had this combination. Those things that were explicit, certain, and those that were speculative. It could apply to authenticity, it could apply to meaning. And so you end up with 4 permutations. That every fatwa is based on evidence that is either certain in authenticity and certain in meaning. Like the Quran is certain in authenticity. The Quran says Aqimus Salat. It's backed up by Sunnah, so we have no doubt in the authenticity, no doubt in the meaning. That there's a hereafter. It comes from the Quran, which is certain in authenticity, and there's no doubt what does it mean when Allah says there's a hereafter. Or that Allah is one, or any of those fundamental parts of our Aqidah, or those that we should stand for justice. It's not maybe, no, it's very explicit in the Quran and in the Sunnah, and because it comes from the Quran, no doubt. Some things are certain in their authenticity, they are coming from the Quran or Sunnah Mutawatir, but they are speculative in meaning. So differences of opinion would occur because they differ on the tafsir. Some have speculative authenticity. Single chain hadith, qiyas, ijma, anything other than Quran and Sunnah Mutawatir is considered dhanni thubut, even if the meaning is clear. And some things, the authenticity is under question and the meaning is under question. The moment you are no more in level 1, please chill. Just calm down. Yeah, don't destroy, don't leave certainty because of an area there's speculation around.
In Hadith Ahad, even though it's Sahih, it's still under speculative authenticity.
Yes, because of possible human error. Like you trust the people, so you will take it in the absence of anything else, but you take it with the understanding that there still could be error. So for the Maliki, for example, no need for going inside. Maqasid, the purposes, objectives, aims, goals, intents of Sharia. That's what we mean. And they're generally 2. 1, to promote and protect benefit and good, which is called maslahah. And the second objective is to avoid and prevent harm or evil or suffering, called mafsadah. What scholars find is, if you look at all the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah, you end up finding they are trying to achieve one of 2 things. They are either trying to bring benefit or remove harm. Enjoin right or forbid wrong. What they call accruing of maslahah, jalbul masalih, or darul mafasid, removing mafsadah. But of course, for some, since avoiding and preventing harm and removing evil and suffering is beneficial and good, they just say, then the maqasid of Sharia are all about maslahah, it's about benefit. So some use the word maslahah interchangeably with maqasid. Examples of maqasid and the levels of certainty. The scholars, by looking again at the teachings of the Quran and Sunnah, based on texts that are very explicitly clear, adding to them, that's the qat'i, adding to them those that are dhanni, they reach certain conclusions that they are all certain about. That Sharia is interested in the protection of faith, of deen. And this comes from the prohibitions of shirk, the hudu ila sabili rabbik, the instructions to share faith, the prescription of the articles of faith, in the deen of the Islam, and the respect for other people's faith, like graffiti, no compulsion in religion. That looking at all the instructions to do with life, Sharia is interested in the protection and preservation of life. So it prohibits murder, and it punishes murder, and it considers it one of the greatest rewarding things to save the life of an innocent person. And then all the hadith on look for medicine and all things to do with security, everything to protect life. Then they look at the things that Islam prohibits regarding intoxicants and alcohol, and the promotion of education, talab al-ilm faridatun, the search for knowledge is compulsory. What's all this about? The preservation of the mind and intellectual faculties and the enhancement of mind through education and seeking knowledge. Then they look at commands surrounding family, the encouragement to marry, the rights of children, the rights of wife, etc. There's the conclusion that Islam is pro-family. That Islam is pro-protection of wealth. That's why it punishes, and the other, like every maqasid has certain punishments that are there to handle mafsada, harm to those maqasid. And as such, so zina is prohibited, and protection of family, so you will actually punish anybody who tries to spoil the name of a family by accusing them of zina, for example. You will punish theft, you will encourage labor, encourage sadaqah, wealth distribution, etc. So these are generally the main categories of maqasid, but other scholars like Shatibi Ibn Taymiyyah say there's no limit to the number. You can classify them into whatever you want. But if you start looking more carefully, to forgive and have compassion, the Prophet was sent illa rahmah, as a rahmah to mankind. That justice is a maqasid of Sharia. Allah yuridu bikumul yusra, Allah wants ease for you. Wala yuridu bikumul usra, He does not want hardship. In other words, ease and facilitation is a maqasid of Sharia. You're not allowed to slaughter an animal in a cruel manner. And so many hadith on that point to the idea that justice doesn't just apply to humans, but you should not be cruel, you should not be oppressive. So by looking at all of these, scholars are able to come up with a level of certainty regarding certain things that Sharia is expected to achieve based on clear, multiple hadith and verses of the Quran. Because these maqasid are established by so many verses, so many hadith, you can't bring one hadith, interpret it in a context that creates injustice, and you want the scholars to go with your interpretation. They'll go with the maqasid. Why? That's also established by Quran and by Sunnah. And that is why they consider any fatwa that does not achieve a maqasid, but instead goes and achieves a mafsada, a harm, is null and void. It's like a medicine that kills you. It's supposed to heal you. They generally did not like discussing maqasid on ibadah and aqidah because they felt these are not too obvious, but they prefer to talk about them as the wisdom behind these actions. They try to focus more on mu'amalat, but they did appreciate there's the spiritual benefit of strengthening your relationship with Allah and the strengthening of your spiritual immune system in ibadah and aqidah. And so maqasid became a compass on the map of usul al-fiqh and ijtihad, and as we've already discussed, the commander's intent was always important to scholars in their interpretation. The moment any interpretation was going against other verses of the Quran, or what you just call the maqasid, they moved with whatever was in line with maqasid. If you had different fatwas, one was in line with maqasid, they would consider that as being more correct. Why? Because it is supported by extra evidence of all the verses that establish that maqasid. Ibn Jawziyah, Ibn Qayyim, once said, the foundation of Sharia is wisdom and the safeguarding of people's welfare. In this life and in the next. In its entirety, it's about justice, mercy, wisdom, and good. Every rule which replaces justice with injustice, mercy with its opposite, and the common good with mischief, and wisdom with folly, is a ruling that does not belong to the Sharia, even though it might have been claimed to be according to some interpretation. Any interpretation of the Quran and Sunnah that goes against justice, mercy, wisdom, and good, Ibn Qayyim was saying it doesn't belong to the Sharia. Why? It contradicts clear, specific teachings of what Sharia is supposed to achieve. So whatever interpretation it is, you've made a mistake. There's a hierarchical ranking of these maqasid, all those things that the Sharia is trying to achieve. Some of them down here were considered darura or daruriyat, necessities. Necessities of life. Food, water, those survival needs, security, etc. Then you have certain maqasid that were hajiyat or haja, needs that supported these, which if you could get that, you wouldn't fall into darura. And tahsini, desirables or luxuries, were areas that just made you more comfortable. But as human beings, we usually would not help others unless we've reached a level of comfort. If you couldn't pay the school fees, you won't die, but you usually wouldn't help somebody else in any significant way. So, even though these were luxuries, they were still considered maqasid. If you didn't reach a level of comfort where you could have a significant amount of money sitting down doing nothing for a whole year, Sharia did not require you to pay zakat. The wealth had to reach a nisab and it's sitting down for a whole year and you didn't have to touch it. So the key point is, even living a level of comfort was among the maqasid of Sharia. When scholars spoke about good and evil, generally decisions regarding right and wrong were not too difficult if right and wrong was obvious. It's just that when people brought a problem to a scholar, it's because simple assessment was not enough. It was a bit more complicated. This lady is a student. She's in university. She has accepted Islam. Should she tell her family? Yes? No? She should be proud she started wearing hijab. Why are you bringing the question to the scholar? I thought it would be obvious what the answer is. Oh, the reason why it's an issue is because of her circumstance. The family may stop giving her scholarship. They may change her school. We don't know what will happen. So it's not as simple as what's the right thing to do and what's the wrong thing to do. Because in measuring these, scholars look at the scope. When you're going to say something is a greater good or greater evil, how many people are going to be affected and who's going to be affected? The girl or the family? Or you? Yeah. Severity. What really is the suffering if she loses her scholarship? What's the benefit of telling? What's the harm of telling? How long would she go through these difficulties for? What are the side effects? Does it really affect anything? Etc. And so when it comes to good and bad, even when you say something was terrible, very haram, it didn't mean there's no good in it. And when you say something is really good, it didn't mean there are no disadvantages. Everything with advantage comes with some disadvantage. And so there was a need to weigh the good, which is the white part, and the dark part. So alcohol, the Quran says it has advantages, but it says that the bad part is greater than the good. So it is haram. So because something is a lesser evil doesn't mean it's not an evil. It's just a lesser evil than the alternatives. So something that is bad, we still prefer it to something that's worse. if we don't have an alternative. We don't say, well, all these three are all haram. No, we still are forced to choose which is a lesser haram if the halal is not an option. So just criticizing things in Islamic finance, in fatwas, doing whatever, there's still haram there. What's your alternative? If nothing, it's still a lesser evil, even if you are pointing to the evil. But don't get blinded by the evil as if you talk as if you had an alternative in place. It's not enough to say there's harm in something to say it is haram. A person may be killed by a car on his way to work. A woman may be raped on her way to school. That's bad. But because there's a possibility doesn't mean it is haram. You also have to consider the probability of happening. Are you certain or almost certain it will happen? Then they would say haram. But if it's only probable or rare, it was left as mubah. So the key point here, and this is related to Saddu Dariya, blocking means it wasn't enough that there's a possibility of harm and the harm would be severe, but the probability also. So just because a car could kill you on your way to work doesn't mean you should not go to work. We'll quickly look at licenses and necessities. And these are generally what they call ruksa, or licenses or concessions. Fatwa Dariya, which is the opposite of Fatwa Dariya, means opening the means. Now the things that are haram, you're going to allow them. And these are based on a number of verses of the Quran that have been crystallized into two major maxims. One, that ad-darar yuzal, harm must be eliminated, which we've discussed. And you have hadith, la darar wa la dirar. And then hardship begets facility. That when al-mashaqqa tajlibu taysir, when things start getting difficult, you find Sharia relaxing laws. A woman is in her periods, certain laws get relaxed. You're traveling, certain laws get relaxed. You're sick, cut down on fasting. You're this. So these are all just examples of what is used to establish that as a maxim. So where the harm can be removed, it should be removed. When it cannot be removed, then the hardship should get some facility. There should be relaxation of laws. So let's look at the necessity and let's look at the harm. Let's look at the circumstance. They classify the circumstances into what we've already said, darura, haja, and tahsini. And they classify the hardships into two, the harams into two. Haram of the means and haram of the ends. And we'll look at these each. This we've already discussed. In classifying the hardship, a person may be in darura, life-threatening necessity. Haja, not life-threatening, but very uncomfortable and likely to lead you into darura. And tahsini, no threat. Just uncomfortable, but you can manage. Fasting is not comfortable, but you can manage. These haja, we look at them with straight lines. In reality, they are overlapping. And because of this overlap, you have circumstances where the scholars would debate on whether it's a haja or a darura. So this is just to remember that because of the overlap, you will have differing opinions. When it comes to haram, certain things are haram in and of themselves, like zina. Certain things are haram of the ways. Being in a room alone, hugging, dressing in an immodest way, is haram because of what it will lead to. It's still haram, but it's haram of the means, what they call haram of the wasail. Whereas these are haram of the maqasid. Yeah. Zina is the mafsada. These are those things that will lead to the mafsada. Some are very close, and because of this, you have areas of overlap. And scholars would argue on whether a particular haram is of the means or of the ends. When you look at the gradation of desirability and undesirability, because you have to classify harams, there's makruh, which means it's discouraged, which is less than haram of the means, which is less than haram of the ends. But of course, even between haram and makruh, there's a makruh tahrimi. Yeah. So you can find There are certain things that are haram, but some are the kaba'ir. They are major sins, others are minor. They're all haram, but some are greater than others. So knowledge of how to classify haram, not just put them all together. Because where you are to choose what they call ahafu dararain, the lesser of two evils, they are all evil, nobody's arguing about them. But you have to come up with a criteria of how do you separate greater from lesser. So they would consider the evil objective, what they call the mafsada, the harm itself, like murder or rape, that is haram in and of itself. The woman traveling without a mahram is haram because it will put her in an unsecure situation. That is haram because of what it could lead to. So the key thing is to understand there's a gradation. And for those who like graphs, basically, here you've got somebody who is in a luxury situation, somebody has an important need, somebody in dire necessity. The more the difficulty you're going into, this is the line of permissibility, the more the severity of the haram that will be allowed. So if you are in a comfortable situation, you can only do halal. If things start getting difficult, they would relax haram of the means. You're not allowed to look at a woman in any way that is generating lust in you. General rule. This person comes to the Prophet ﷺ and says, I am planning to get married. Prophet said, have you seen her? He said, no. Prophet said, go and see her. Perchance you would be more excited than you presently are. It's not darura, he wasn't going to die. Marriage is haja. Haja allows haram of the means because in this situation it's not greed, it's not leading to zina. It's leading to marriage, and marriage is sunnah. And then somebody in darura, you're about to die, then alcohol, pork, other things. General rule here, greater difficulty, greater allowances. The greater the gravity and the situation, and the severity of the hardship or suffering, now the greater the darura, the greater the quality and quantity of concessions, allowances and licenses given by Sharia. Increase difficulty, increase allowances. Different ways of saying the same thing. But this is generally temporary. Yeah. When the situation goes, the difficulty decreases, then the haram that you were allowed to do is no more haram. Sorry, it becomes a haram. When does the haram become permissible? Summary. In a state of darura, life-threatening necessity, most prohibitions of means and ends are regarded as temporarily permissible. Mubah or even mustahab for the duration of the necessity, as a lesser evil. In a state of haja, not darura now, haja, those prohibitions that are haram of the means are temporarily permissible, but haram of the ends remain prohibited. Number 4, a state of haja temporarily permits actions regarding which there is debate or disagreement among the scholars regarding its prohibition in Sharia. So where there's disagreement, a woman has been raped. Can she have an abortion? Still just 1 month or 2 months old. The Hanafi say, so long as the child is not up to 120 days old, she can have an abortion. Others say no. She's been raped. It's going to mess up her education. The moment she gets into haja, you use the existence of disagreement for taysir. Prophet said, Yassir wa la tu'asir, make things easy for people, don't make them difficult. Yeah. Allah yuridu bikum al-yusra wa la yuridu bikum al-usra. Allah wants ease, Allah does not want difficulty. So make the difference of opinion a reason for somebody in haja to have an easier way out. If this person was not raped, is not pregnant, this is just an academic discussion, you can stand by your guns of what you believe this is right, and you believe that opinion is wrong. But when you're dealing with a haja, put your mind, you're now a doctor, create a lesser evil. Yeah. So you use the difference of opinion as a reason for people who are facing haja. When a whole society is in a state of haja, it is close to a state of emergency, and therefore hajas are treated as darura, which makes most haram of the means and ends temporarily permissible. So when a society is going through famine, a society is going through a big thing, then you find certain things that are fard being suspended, certain things that are haram being suspended. So the moment society gets into haja, you don't want that. And that's why in Muslim minority areas, certain things like riba would be considered permissible by some scholars because the society is in haja, not in darura. Because if they don't permit riba and there's no alternative means of capital, that Muslim minority every decade will just be getting poorer and poorer and poorer compared to the majority where they are. Yeah, they will not be able to get out of their situation. A threat to luxuries does not justify haram of the means or the ends. Why? Because you're deemed comfortable. So as we said before, generally, the greater the gravity of the situation and the severity of suffering, the greater the quality and quantity of concessions and leniency given. This is where, based on what we've just said, you get the difference between hukum and fatwa. Hukum would just look at what did the Quran say, what's the hukum. Fatwa would look at who's asking the question, what's the context, what are the consequences, is it moving to haja, darura, these are factors that a mufti needs to do. And that's why you could not outsource muftis. Yeah. You needed somebody who understood the context and what it was really going to lead to. And why when new Muslims or anybody who is in haja comes to you with problems, please be very careful about just rattling out standard hukum. Yeah. If you understand the person's problem, look for somebody who knows the subject area to help them. Otherwise, what most people do is haram. Yeah. We don't care about consequences, we don't care about the situation of haja, etc. Why would scholars differ? Or why not? Is there a field in which scholars don't differ? No. Experts in every field differ. And one of the reasons why new innovations take long to be established is because it takes a lot of time to convince people. One way of reducing differences, of course, is to look at specialists. You've got scholars, but you've got what you call really scholars. Some are like GPs, general practitioners, others are more specialists. Specialists can help reduce differences if it is tied to their specialization. If the argument is about a hadith and you've got a hadith scholar who can tell you this is not a strong hadith, good to know. Same with tafsir. Why would scholars differ? Silence in the text is one reason. The Quran and Sunnah are silent on an issue and somebody will need to do something else. In other words, you know that hierarchy we drew? Quran is silent, Sunnah is silent, even when... So once that there's silence there, you're going to have differences because they will resort to different tools. And they consider different tools more credible than others. That's why they differ in the hierarchy. Sometimes apparently conflicting evidence. Apparently conflicting evidence. Wash the bowl of a dog that it licks 7 times, and one of those times with whatever. That seems to suggest there's something wrong with dogs and dog saliva. However, because the Quran also allows you to eat the animal that is caught by your hunting dog, and it has nothing in the Sunnah about washing anything, seems to be contradicting. Surah Al-Kahf, the people of the cave had a dog. Quran seems to have nothing negative about dogs or dog saliva. In the hadith, a hadith says, don't eat an animal that has talons, like bird with claws, or animals with canine teeth, carnivorous animals. But in the Athar, we have Sahaba eating a hyena, another group of Sahaba eating a fox. It's also an Ahad hadith. The Amal doesn't support it. Once you have that kind of conflicting evidence, scholars differ in how they resolve it. Another reason of difference of opinion is differing contexts and assessments. A haja situation will have a different fatwa from a darura situation or a tahsil situation. One, some person said haram, but that was a fatwa. Another person says halal, that's a hukum. Hukum is what does the Quran and Sunnah say, what's the standard. Fatwa was for a particular context. So if you don't know the context, it's easy to say, look at Qaradawi, look at Bimbaya, look at that guy, he's saying this, he's saying that. Go and look at who he's talking to, and then you see why he's different, and why he said this, now he's contradicting himself. You know, Imam Shafi, when he was in Baghdad, used to say this and that. Now he went to Egypt, he's changed. He didn't change, his context changed, and so the fatwas changed. And so, if you say, oh, in this year Ibn Taymiyyah said this and that, yes, this is 2014. If Ibn Taymiyyah was to come back, what would he say now? Stop quoting him as if he was talking to us today. Because you're not being fair to him. You're talking as if he was talking about our own current context. Oh, but Ibn Taymiyyah said, and all the ulama say, who are you quoting? That 20 of them have listed. Yeah, but they did not see this reality we're dealing with. So what's the use of quoting them? Get a scholar who faced this reality, and then we say, what did that scholar say? When scholars differ, yes.
And usually these difference are usually not in Aqidah and Ibadah.
Yeah, there are minimal differences in Aqidah and Ibadah. And the differences in Aqidah and Ibadah that really matter are those ones that are based on qat'i versus clear, decisive verses of the Quran or the Sunnah. Where it is based on dhanni, the scholars have agreed to disagree. Yeah, they still consider the Ash'ari still feel they are right, the Maturidi still feel whatever, they differ there. But they don't say you're out of Islam because of that, they just say it's wrong. Yeah, so takfir only comes when you are contradicting qat'i of the Quran or the Sunnah. It's just that unfortunately we got a lot of ignorant people who will say, this is the meaning, I understand. They didn't know, but there's another way it's understood. And they start takfir on. Yeah.
In that case, how about the Shia?
What about
Shia?
Yeah, sorry, because they agree with the Shahada, Shahadu Allah ila Allah wa Shahadu, because they reject the Sahaba. So some of the Ustad here say kafir, some say they are misguided.
If we go back to the time of the Sahaba, how did Sahaba like Ali handle others who killed Sahaba, like the Khawarij? Khawarij killed Sahaba. They didn't just insult them. They killed them. But they are still considered Muslims, even though they were misguided. And Ali said, had they not fought us, we would not have fought them. Yeah. So if it is how did the Sahaba understand the situation, fine. How do some understand it today? I can't defend that. I mean, that's why throughout history, the Shia have generally, Imamiyah, the major Shia sects, they've been going for Hajj, nobody has stopped them. From the time of the Sahaba, moving on.
Next point of the question, wishing the non-Muslims doing their festival, Christmas, wishing them Merry Christmas. And of course, the school of thought says that no, there's a religious festival, you can wish them. Then the school of thought, like in Malaysia, we have got fatwa saying that you can wish them. We are not wishing them because of the religion, but because of them. You know, I mean, it's more humanity and so on. And how can you explain with this? And
just hold on to that question. So whether you can wish Merry Christmas, it's round the corner. What do you do when scholars differ? Number one, the scholars recommend, unfortunately the scholars differ on what to do when they differ. But generally they propose 10 courses of action. And these are not isolated, these are interrelated. It's not either this or that, but you can have a combination. One is what they call tarjih. You go with the strongest opinion. How do you know the strongest opinion if you're not a scholar? That's difficult. You need to have some good grounding in usul, good grounding in maqasid, to say this opinion is strong, this one is weak. And what complicates it more, you may be a Shafi'i scholar who understands Shafi'i usul, and so you have understood why this opinion is right and why using your methodology the opinion is wrong. But for another scholar who is using a different methodology, you don't use Amal of Medina, you don't use Urf, you don't use Istihsan, others use it and they get to a different conclusion. So when you say this is right, the other one is wrong, this is right just because you are using your methodology. Use his methodology and you see you are wrong. And vice versa. And so when you are going to say this opinion is strong or weak, it's really not as simple as I have evidence for my own, I don't understand the evidence for the other one, and according to my methodology, that one is wrong. You're still just you and your methods and your conclusions. It's because you're using your equations that your own is right. But yours is not the only equation. There's another equation that produces another result. And according to that equation, that one is right. So the question may then be difficult to say which is stronger. And so for some, all right, there's your equation, there's his equation. Which of these equations best achieves the maqasid of Sharia in your own context? And that is where they do what is called talfiq, the following, the mixing or taking of opinions from other madhabs that achieve a maqasid more effectively than the one in your own madhab. This is not for mafsada, this is for achieving maslaha, maqasid. It's not you're trying to escape responsibility, no, it's you're trying to achieve an objective of Sharia. So some would call that the use of istihsan, but it's the concern for the maqasid. Others will say stick to your own madhab, because sticking to your own madhab is what the law of the land follows. So if you don't want problems with the courts, if you don't want to create more social unrest, stick to your madhab. Others would say and go with the majority, the safety in numbers. And the main arguments for ijma, they would put for jamhur, going with the majority. Allah's hand is with the majority. But then most majorities at one time were a minority. So some would say, go with the specialist. Ask those who are specialists in that area. And like here in Malaysia, if the question is to do with Islamic finance, ask somebody who has studied that area, not just anybody who graduated in Islamic studies. Somebody who has specialized in that. You can't find sukuk and takaful and some of these things in your traditional books of fiqh. They are contemporary financial services. Look for a local scholar who understands whether you are in haja or the person concerned is in haja, darura. What are the priorities? What are the consequences of these actions? So for the various opinions, which one is best suited to your context? In that sense, this is a little similar to the maqasid. Which one is more in line with your urf, your custom? What kind of hijab will you wear? What kind of name should a person who embraces Islam hold on to? The custom at the time of the Prophet was you keep the name of your culture. So if you are Bilal, you keep your Bilal. If you are Umar, you keep Umar. If you are whatever, you keep your whatever. Maybe that's why Limju soon kept it. So look at urf and what is customarily accepted. Otherwise, you make it difficult for people to accept things that are contrary to their culture. Particularly if you're giving them something that belongs to another culture, when they are proud of their own, and Allah recognizes our differences. The easiest and most convenient opinion. This is based on the hadith and verse of the Quran. Make things easy for people, don't make them difficult. And then the opinion of leadership. Leadership usually makes its decisions on the public interest or the common good. Following leadership respects unity, gives greater social cohesion, gives stability, avoids unnecessary disunity. You have the ayah, Atiullah wa Atiur Rasul wa ulil amri minkum. Obey Allah, obey the Prophet, and those who have been put in authority. And unfortunately, of course, leadership doesn't always tell you why they do what they do. So you just assume they are choosing what is in the interest of the majority. And lastly, follow your conscience. Al-umur bimaqasidiha. Innamal a'mal binniyat. Ultimately, you are the one to stand before Allah. Why did you go with majority? Why did you go with your madhab? Why did you go with this? Why did you pick any of these? You will answer. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Istafta qalbuk walau aftaka, walau aftaka, walau aftaka naftu." Consult your conscience, even if people give you fatwa upon fatwa upon fatwa. Ultimately, you will stand before Allah. Yeah.
Any difference between Jumhur and Ijma?
Yes. Jumhur just means majority. Ijma usually means consensus. It's generally used to mean absolute, though in reality, there's always dissenting voices.
So about number 4, how about the hadith that the Prophet says, if you follow the majority, you get answer?
I'm not aware of. Majority of scholars. Yeah. Majority of scholars. Summary, what we've already discussed. We looked at the representing the messenger and the development of a consistent methodology and the search for the straight path and the tools that the Mujtahid uses. We looked at the search for certainty, identifying the difference between a relative truth or a speculative truth from what was absolutely certain, and separating the eternal from the historical, the sunnah from the seerah, the code or maxims of the Mujtahid when dealing with reality. We looked at the aims and objectives of Sharia and keeping the end in mind. Maqasid as a compass on the map of usul, and the safety net principles and the limits of formal logic, protecting the spirit of Sharia from mistaken ijtihad or wrong application. And then of course, when engaging with diversity in the search for truth, what do you do with that? In conclusion, with all the diversity, we have a clearer idea of where our unity is, what we are united about. Those things that are explicitly clear in the Quran and the Sunnah. And that's sufficient unity. Unity did not mean uniformity. Difference of opinion did not mean disunity. There's always been difference of opinion. There always will be. But what we have in common that is explicitly clear from the Quran or from the Sunnah is more important than those things upon which we differ. Why? Particularly because it comes from the Quran and the Sunnah Mutawatir, and there's no doubt about it. Differences on any other thing is difference based on an area where scholars agree there's some level of speculation. This one. Separating the eternal from the historical. The difference between the Sunnah and the Seerah, where we discussed briefly, Seerah refers to the whole biography of the Prophet, everything that was done, etc. But not everything that he did was meant to be emulated. There are certain things he did just in his capacity as a prophet. Only he, 9 wives, only he this, only he that. Certain things he did just because he had a personal preference. He didn't like eating this just because he personally did it. So, what the scholars do is divide the Sunnah into what they call those sunnah that are tashri', they are of legislative implication, and ghayr tashri' that are not of legislative implication. It's good to know, but it's not binding. I think some of you will be having the Sharia intelligence material eventually, where all this is in more detail. So please do not allow difference of opinion to disunite us on clear things that have come from the Quran. Yeah. Don't let difference of opinion over qiyas, over ahad hadith, over ijma, over sadr zariya, over any of these to undermine those clear statements of the Quran about our brotherhood. We differ, so did they. Some of the Sahaba, Ibn Umar and Ibn Mas'ud differed, according to some of the scholars, on over 100 issues. Yeah, that was a lot of issues. But they still consider themselves brothers, not clones. We can all be wrong. You only know when you are wrong when you continue learning. So we must stay curious, we must stay humble in our opinions and sincere. In conclusion, as we've said before, at the end of this short thing, you're not a mufti, you're not a mujtahid, you're not a scholar. Hopefully, we all understand better what mujtahid imams and muftis actually do, and why their job is so difficult, and why it's easy for people who don't know what's going on in that field to quickly start giving them names. No, Qardawi is this. No, this scholar is that. No, that scholar is, you, as if you know anything. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Questions?
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Happy Deepavali.
Saying Merry Christmas. Is it okay for you to say Merry Christmas? Number one, is there anything is it ibadah or mu'amalat? Okay, it's a greeting, right? So if you say it's mu'amalat, then we want certainty of evidence prohibiting it from the Quran. Is there anything in the Quran prohibiting it? No. Anything in the mutawatir hadith prohibiting it? That you are certain? No. So calm down. Why? Because prohibition is going to come from elsewhere. Anything in the hadith? No. You will then move to any of the other tools of ijtihad, qiyas, etc. So number one, don't add bitterness to the debate. You can understand just from there, the moment it's not tackled here, somebody is going to differ. For some, the reason why they say it's mu'amalat is because it's not tied to accepting an aqidah. When the Prophet gave the Christians of Najran the mosque as a venue where they could pray, was he by giving them a venue saying, therefore, I accept your prayers and it's okay with me? No, it was just giving them a venue. When a Jew, let's take a Christian, when a Christian says, Happy Ramadan, is he implying that he has now accepted Ramadan and accepted Islam, or the Quran is the word of God? No. When an atheist says Happy Christmas, is he implying he is no more an atheist? No. So in some cultures, these greetings are purely mu'amalat. They're just greetings. Happy Christmas, happy this, happy that. For some scholars, they understand that if you say Happy Christmas, you mean, this is their assumption about what you mean. That when this person says Happy Christmas, you are implying you have accepted Christmas and Jesus being Son of God and all the other shirk. Therefore, you are doing what is called wilaya. You are accepting something that goes contrary to Sharia. And that's why they say it's haram, because they don't look at it as just simple ibadah. They look at it as compromising aqidah. You're doing something that contradicts. Because that is their reasoning, they say it's haram. But this comes up usually because of a difference in urf of the scholar talking. This happens when you go and pick on Sheikh Google or Mufti YouTube to give you fatwas in your situation when the scholar was talking about his context, his understanding. And part of the reason we're doing this is not that you can now give your own fatwa, but when one scholar says there's no problem, the other scholar says there is a problem, you can ask yourself, which of these achieves our maqasid or the maqasid of Sharia better? In this context of Malaysia or Nigeria, is it in any way leading to shirk? And you say no. this is not an acceptance of their whatever. It's just ibad. It's just mu'amalat. It's just a greeting. Do you accept when they say Happy Eid or Happy Ramadan? Yes. Why do they say it?
They believe in Tawheed.
Partly. Or it may be just because they're just wishing you a nice time. It's just establishing or strengthening of relationship. So if Sharia can allow you to marry a woman who believes Jesus is God and Trinity and all of that, and eat animal they've slaughtered, but that marriage is not an implicit acceptance of all they believe, then why should saying Merry Christmas be a big issue? If part of the reason behind permitting limited marriage and eating of their food is to strengthen relations, that Islam is interested in building ties, is this an opportunity to build ties? That's one. Secondly, sorry, you all just waste your time. Is it a haram of the ends, or are you saying it's haram because of what you think it will lead to? If it's haram because you think of what it will lead to, then scholars would say it's haram of the means. If it's haram of the means, some people in their society are in haja, they are Muslim minorities. Because they are minorities, they need to be very careful about hurting the majorities. Yeah. Majorities can be very oppressive, depends on where you are. And sometimes even things that you would not on your own have wanted, you feel, well, we don't need non-Muslims in the mosque. Okay, but there are difference of opinion. Some say it's okay, some say it's not okay. Yes, but for the sake of interfaith bridge building, we are in a haja where we will use the difference of opinion. That's even if you consider it prohibited, to permit it. And so, in answering some of these questions, be careful how you push your own opinion online when you're not in the society of the person asking the question. There's some Muslims who Jewish minorities during their festivals invite politicians and others to go to their synagogues as a way of just saying, we've got no problem with you, we don't dehumanize you in any way. You're most welcome. And if Muslims don't do that, questions start being asked. And so it is in the interest of the haja of the community to do what it even considers to be a haram of the means. That is, even if you do consider it haram, it's haram of the means. So even a scholar who would say, I'm not comfortable with this, should respect the society is answering the question to. Yeah. But just because you're in a comfort and you're in passing a situation is not a problem, you can, it can be an intellectual thing for you. For others, it's real situation. So those 2 points, I hope help answer that question. Assalamu alaikum.
Alhamdulillah. Okay, we'll take a short break for lunch. We'll be back here at 2:30. So we have your lunch, and then we have our Salat Jum'ah, and then we'll be back at 2:30. Is it okay? Okay, thank you. See you later. Assalamu alaikum.